Yes, I can help with JoshuaSelman sermons. Apostle JoshuaSelman is a Nigerian Christian minister, teacher, and founder of Monomania. His sermons are widely known for their depth. Beloved, it is important for you to understand that every day is not just a calendar event. Every day is a spiritual territory waiting to be governed. Morning is not merely a time of awakening from sleep, it is a gate. And whoever controls the gate controls the outcomes of the day. Every day carries a spiritual weight that many people overlook because they see time only from a physical perspective. But in the realm of the spirit, days are not neutral. They are loaded with possibilities, decisions, encounters, and consequences. To start a day with God is to acknowledge that life is not self-sustaining and that human strength, intelligence, or planning is never enough to guarantee victory. The moment a person wakes up, they step into a field where forces are already active. And the question is not whether something will influence the day, but what will be allowed to influence it. Beginning the day with God is an act of alignment. It is a deliberate decision to submit the direction, atmosphere, and outcomes of the day to divine authority. When a man or woman turns to God in the morning, they are not merely performing a religious routine. They are positioning themselves under a higher government. This posture says, I refuse to let randomness define my life. I choose order, purpose, and divine direction. Alignment in the morning helps the heart, the mind, and the spirit move in one direction before distractions begin to pull in many directions. There is also the mystery of spiritual sensitivity that comes with early communion with God. The morning hours carry a unique stillness that makes it easier to discern divine instructions. Before the noise of responsibilities, conversations, and pressure sets in, the spirit of a man is more receptive. When the day is started with God, clarity is often received that saves hours of confusion later. Many errors that happen during the day are not because people are careless, but because they never paused early enough to receive guidance. Starting the day with God also establishes spiritual authority. Authority is not something you demand later in the day when situations have already escalated. It is something you establish at the beginning. When you speak to God first, you gain the confidence to speak to situations later. Prayer in the morning sets the tone of dominion, reminding the believer that they are not at the mercy of events, but are empowered to influence outcomes. This confidence is not arrogance. It flows from knowing that one is backed by heaven. Another powerful dimension of beginning the day with God is the covering it provides. Life is filled with uncertainties and unseen dangers. Not every threat announces itself, and not every challenge comes with a warning. Morning prayer is a way of placing the entire day under divine protection. It is an acknowledgement that human awareness is limited, but God's sight is perfect. By committing the day to Him, one is trusting that even paths not yet walked are already watched over. There is also the transformation of the inner man that happens when God is the first focus of the day. Anxiety, fear, and pressure often lose their grip when the heart is first anchored in God's presence. Instead of reacting emotionally to situations, a person who starts the day with God responds from a place of peace. This inner stability becomes a strength, especially when the day presents unexpected challenges. The presence of God becomes a reference point, reminding the believer that they are never alone. Ultimately, starting the day with God is an investment into destiny. It is a daily declaration that life has meaning beyond survival. Over time, this practice builds spiritual discipline, sharpens discernment, and strengthens faith. Days that begin with God are more likely to end with gratitude, because they are lived with awareness, direction, and dependence on divine help. It is in this consistent surrender of each morning that lives are shaped, mistakes are reduced, and victories become more frequent and lasting. Prophetic alignment in the morning is the conscious act of bringing one's life into agreement with divine timing, divine order, and divine intention before the day fully unfolds. It recognizes that heaven operates by patterns and principles, and one of those principles is that alignment precedes manifestation. When a person aligns early, they are not struggling to fix outcomes later. They are positioning themselves correctly from the beginning. The morning is a strategic window where spiritual currents are still fluid and direction can be set with clarity and authority. Alignment begins with understanding that prophecy is not only about foretelling future events, it is about partnering with God's intentions for the present. When you wake up and deliberately present yourself before God, you are saying that your actions, decisions, and responses must reflect what heaven has already written. This awareness shifts prayer from being reactive to being intentional. Instead of praying because something went wrong, you are praying so that things go right. This posture transforms the believer from a victim of circumstances into a participant in divine purpose. The morning hours carry a unique spiritual atmosphere because they represent beginnings. In scripture and spiritual law, beginnings determine trajectories. When alignment is established early, the rest of the day naturally follows that spiritual direction. This is why prophetic people understand the importance of speaking words of agreement in the morning. These words are not empty declarations. They are spiritual confirmations that invite heaven's agenda to take precedence over personal plans. In this moment, the heart is trained to value God's will above convenience or habit. Prophetic alignment also sharpens discernment. When the spirit is aligned, it becomes easier to recognize what to pursue and what to avoid. Many people waste energy fighting battles they were never meant to engage simply because they lacked early direction. Alignment helps filter decisions, revealing which opportunities are divinely orchestrated and which are distractions. This clarity saves time, protects emotional strength, and preserves spiritual focus. It is often in the morning that subtle warnings and gentle instructions are released, preventing costly mistakes later in the day. Another important aspect of prophetic alignment is the alignment of speech. Words spoken in the morning carry weight because they are released before other voices compete for attention. When a believer declares truth, peace, victory, and purpose early, those words begin to frame the day. Prophetic alignment teaches that speech must agree with divine reality, not visible circumstances. Even when challenges are anticipated, aligned speech does not amplify fear, it reinforces faith. This habit conditions the mind to think from a heavenly perspective rather than a limited human viewpoint. Alignment in the morning also brings emotional stability. When the soul is submitted to God early, it becomes less vulnerable to sudden emotional swings. Pressure, disappointment, and provocation may still arise, but they are filtered through a heart that is already anchored. This stability is not emotional suppression, it is emotional governance. By aligning with God, the believer allows the Spirit to regulate responses, ensuring that reactions do not sabotage destiny or relationships. Over time, consistent prophetic alignment produces a disciplined spiritual life. It builds sensitivity, obedience, and confidence in divine guidance. The believer begins to notice patterns of divine intervention, favor, and preservation that are not coincidental. Days begin to feel purposeful rather than chaotic, and decisions become more deliberate. This is because alignment creates a rhythm where the human spirit moves in harmony with heaven. In essence, prophetic alignment in the morning is about agreement. It is the daily choice to let God lead first. When alignment is established early, grace follows throughout the day. What might have required struggle becomes easier, and what could have ended in confusion is resolved with wisdom. The day may still have challenges, but it will not lack direction because it began in alignment with the one who sees the end from the beginning. Prayer as a tool for spiritual legislation is the understanding that prayer is not merely an emotional appeal or a moment of religious expression, but an authorized means by which believers enforce divine will within the earth. Many people approach prayer as if they are trying to persuade God to act. But true spiritual legislation begins with the revelation that God has already spoken, already willed, and already established certain realities. Prayer becomes powerful when it shifts from begging to enforcing alignment between heaven and earth. Spiritual legislation through prayer is rooted in authority. Authority is delegated, not assumed. When a believer prays in alignment with God's word and purpose, they are operating within delegated spiritual jurisdiction. This is why prayer is effective. It is not human effort attempting to reach heaven, but heaven empowering humanity to act on its behalf. When prayer is understood this way, confidence replaces fear and clarity replaces confusion. The one praying understands that they are not powerless, they are authorized. The morning is a strategic time for this kind of prayer because it allows legislation before confrontation. Instead of reacting to situations after they occur, spiritual legislation establishes boundaries ahead of time. Through prayer, the believer sets spiritual parameters for the day, determining what is permitted and what is resisted. This is not arrogance or presumption. It is obedience to the responsibility of spiritual stewardship. Silence does not mean neutrality. It often means surrender. When a believer refuses to be silent, they are declaring their responsibility over their life and territory. Prayer as legislation also involves speaking. Spoken prayer is a release of spiritual authority because words carry legal power in the spirit realm. Creation responds to sound when that sound is backed by divine authority. When a believer speaks God's truth in prayer, they are not merely expressing hope, they are making a spiritual decree. These decrees shape atmospheres, influence decisions, and disrupt patterns that oppose divine purpose. The consistency of such declarations trains the spirit to operate from authority rather than fear. Another dimension of spiritual legislation is responsibility. When authority is exercised, accountability follows. Legislative prayer requires spiritual maturity because it demands alignment with God's character and intentions. It is not about enforcing personal desires, but about representing God's interests. This is why intimacy with God is essential. Without knowing His will, legislation becomes flawed. Effective prayer flows from relationship where the heart understands what God values and seeks to establish. Spiritual legislation through prayer also confronts resistance. Opposition does not mean prayer has failed. It often means that prayer has been recognized. When authority is exercised, resistance may arise, but persistence reinforces legitimacy. Just as laws are upheld through enforcement, spiritual decrees are maintained through consistent prayer and faith. This persistence strengthens spiritual endurance and teaches the believer not to retreat at the first sign of challenge. This kind of prayer reshapes the believer's mindset. Instead of seeing life as something that happens to them, they begin to see life as something they are called to steward. Challenges are no longer viewed as overwhelming threats, but as opportunities to exercise authority. This shift produces courage, discipline, and resilience. The believer understands that prayer is not an escape from responsibility, it is the means by which responsibility is fulfilled. Over time, prayer as spiritual legislation produces visible results. Patterns of defeat are broken, cycles of delay are disrupted, and doors that seemed permanently closed begin to open. These outcomes are not magic, they are the natural result of alignment, authority, and consistency. The believer learns that prayer is not just preparation for action, it is action in the spirit realm. Ultimately, spiritual legislation through prayer is about partnership. God chooses to work through people who understand their role. When a believer embraces prayer as legislation, they step into a higher level of spiritual responsibility, where words shape reality and faith governs outcomes. The day may still bring challenges, but it will also reveal victories, because it has been legislated under divine authority. Engaging divine mercy before engaging human activity is an expression of spiritual wisdom that recognizes the limitations of human effort and the supremacy of God's compassion. Mercy is not a reward for perfection, it is God's provision for human frailty. To seek mercy early in the day is to acknowledge that no matter how careful, intelligent, or disciplined a person may be, they are still dependent on grace to navigate life successfully. This understanding keeps the heart humble and receptive to divine help. Mercy functions as a covering that addresses both known and unknown weaknesses. There are mistakes a person is aware of, and there are errors they will never recognize until consequences appear. By engaging mercy before the day begins, the believer places their entire life under divine compassion, trusting God to correct what they cannot see and protect them from what they cannot predict. This posture is not fear-driven, it is faith-driven, rooted in the assurance that God's mercy is sufficient and active. Beginning the day by seeking mercy also resets the conscience. Guilt and condemnation are heavy burdens that weaken spiritual sensitivity and confidence. When mercy is embraced early, the heart is cleansed from the weight of yesterday's failures. This freedom allows the believer to approach the day without shame, able to hear God clearly and respond boldly. Mercy does not excuse irresponsibility, it restores relationship. From that restored place, growth and obedience become possible. Engaging mercy first also influences decision making. A heart aware of mercy becomes more cautious, not out of fear, but out of reverence. It recognizes that every opportunity and success is sustained by grace, not entitlement. This awareness guards against pride, which often leads to careless choices. When mercy is acknowledged early, it becomes easier to walk in wisdom, patience, and restraint throughout the day. Decisions are made with an awareness of accountability to God. Another dimension of mercy is preservation. Life is filled with invisible intersections where timing, movement, and choice could result in harm or safety. Many testimonies of protection are not the result of human alertness, but divine intervention. Engaging mercy in the morning is a way of surrendering the unknown paths of the day to God's oversight. It is trusting that even when plans change or delays occur, God's mercy is actively rearranging events for good. Mercy also governs interactions with others. When a person begins the day conscious of God's mercy toward them, they are more inclined to extend patience and kindness. Offenses are less likely to escalate, and conflicts are handled with wisdom rather than impulse. This internal posture shapes relationships, reduces unnecessary battles, and reflects God's character. Mercy received becomes mercy expressed, creating an atmosphere of peace and cooperation. Engaging mercy before activity also protects from spiritual exhaustion. Many people burn out because they rely solely on effort, striving to control every outcome. Mercy reminds the believer that they are not carrying life alone. This awareness releases unnecessary pressure and restores inner strength. Instead of forcing results, the believer learns to flow with divine assistance. This balance between effort and dependence preserves joy and endurance. Over time, consistently engaging divine mercy cultivates spiritual maturity. The believer becomes less judgmental, more discerning, and deeply aware of God's faithfulness. Failures no longer define identity, and successes no longer inflate ego. Life is viewed through the lens of grace, where every day is an opportunity for alignment rather than performance. Ultimately, engaging divine mercy before human activity is about placing God first, not only in words but in trust. It declares that life is safest, richest, and most meaningful when lived under the covering of compassion. As the day unfolds, challenges may arise, but mercy ensures that they do not have the final word. Instead, the day becomes a testimony of preservation, restoration, and quiet victories sustained by grace. Activating divine covering and preservation is a spiritual consciousness that understands that life exists in both visible and invisible dimensions. Many of the most critical battles a person faces do not announce themselves openly, and many dangers are not detected by human senses. To deliberately seek divine covering is to acknowledge that safety is not guaranteed by awareness, strength, or planning alone, but by the watchful oversight of God. This realization produces humility and dependence, not fear. Divine covering is more than protection from physical harm. It includes preservation of purpose, peace, and destiny. There are attacks designed not to destroy the body, but to weaken resolve, distort perception, and derail focus. When a believer activates divine covering early, they are asking God to guard not only their steps, but also their mind, emotions, and decisions. This holistic preservation ensures that the day does not drain what it cannot destroy. Preservation also speaks to continuity. Many people begin well but fail to finish strong because something along the way erodes consistency. Divine preservation sustains momentum. It protects spiritual hunger, moral discipline, and clarity of vision. By seeking this covering, the believer is asking God to keep them aligned even when the day presents distractions or pressure. This request acknowledges that finishing well is just as important as starting well. Another aspect of divine covering is immunity from unnecessary losses. Not every loss is a lesson. Some losses are avoidable. Preservation guards against careless mistakes, misjudgments, and harmful associations. When divine covering is activated, God can redirect paths, delay plans, or interrupt routines to prevent damage. These interruptions are not inconveniences, they are interventions. Understanding this transforms frustration into gratitude, recognizing that what seemed like delay was actually protection. Divine covering also operates through angels and divine assignments. Scripture reveals that God delegates protection through spiritual agents, ensuring that those who trust in Him are watched over. Activating this covering in the morning is a way of acknowledging and cooperating with these divine arrangements. It is an invitation for heaven's systems to be actively involved in the details of the day. This awareness builds confidence, knowing that one is never walking alone. Preservation extends to relationships and environments. Some dangers are subtle, arising through conversations, influences, or emotional connections. Divine covering helps regulate exposure, guiding the believer away from harmful interactions and toward edifying ones. This guidance is often gentle, expressed through unease or peace. By valuing this inner witness, the believer avoids entanglements that could compromise integrity or peace. Activating divine covering also stabilizes the heart during uncertainty. Knowing that preservation is in place allows the believer to move through the day without anxiety. Confidence replaces fear, not because risks are absent, but because trust is present. This calmness is itself a form of strength, enabling wise responses rather than impulsive reactions. It also reflects faith, demonstrating reliance on God's oversight rather than constant self-defense. Over time, consistently seeking divine covering creates a lifestyle of awareness and gratitude. Testimonies of near misses, timely warnings, and unexpected help accumulate, reinforcing trust in God's faithfulness. The believer becomes more sensitive to divine guidance and more appreciative of everyday mercies that often go unnoticed. This awareness deepens relationship with God and strengthens spiritual discernment. Ultimately, activating divine covering and preservation is an act of surrender and faith. It declares that life is safest when entrusted to God's care. As the day unfolds, challenges may arise, but preservation ensures they do not overwhelm or derail destiny. Instead, the believer moves through the day upheld, guided, and guarded, confident that their life is hidden under divine watchfulness and sustained by a power greater than their own. Declaring victory over the day before it unfolds is a spiritual practice rooted in the understanding that outcomes are often shaped long before events become visible. Many people wait to see how a day will treat them before deciding how to respond, but faith operates in the opposite direction. Faith speaks first. To declare victory early is not denial of potential challenges. It is the conscious decision to frame those challenges within the assurance of divine help and triumph. Victory begins in the realm of perspective. When a person rises and declares that the day will produce good, progress, and peace, they are training their mind to expect alignment rather than disaster. Expectation influences interpretation. Situations that might otherwise feel overwhelming are approached with confidence and patience because the heart has already been anchored in hope. This inner posture does not remove effort, it empowers effort. The believer works with assurance rather than anxiety. Declarations are powerful because words shape reality. Spoken words do not merely express internal thoughts, they release spiritual direction. When victory is declared in alignment with God's promises, those words become instruments that influence atmosphere and behavior. Fear loses its grip, confusion weakens, and clarity begins to emerge. These declarations are not magical formulas. They are expressions of faith that align the believer's spirit with divine truth. Declaring victory early also establishes authority over emotional responses. Many defeats are not external. They occur internally through discouragement, fear, or self-doubt. When victory is proclaimed in the morning, the believer preemptively resists these internal battles. The heart is reminded that challenges do not define identity or outcome. This emotional stability enables wise decision making and prevents reactions that could sabotage progress. Another important dimension of declaring victory is resilience. When difficulties arise, the believer who has already declared victory is less likely to retreat. Instead of seeing obstacles as signs of failure, they are interpreted as part of a larger process that still leads to success. This mindset fuels perseverance. Victory is not seen as the absence of struggle, but as the assurance that struggle will not have the final word. Declaring victory before the day unfolds also influences interactions with others. Confidence rooted in faith changes communication, body language, and attitude. People respond differently to someone who carries calm assurance rather than insecurity. This influence can open doors, ease tensions, and create opportunities for favor. Victory declared internally becomes visible externally through demeanor and conduct. There is also a prophetic dimension to declaring victory. Prophetic speech does not wait for evidence, it speaks according to divine intention. By declaring victory, the believer is agreeing with what God has already spoken concerning life, purpose, and destiny. This agreement invites divine assistance, aligning circumstances and resources in ways that may not be immediately visible, but become evident over time. Consistency is key in this practice. Declaring victory occasionally produces encouragement, but declaring victory daily builds spiritual momentum. Over time, the believer begins to notice patterns of breakthrough, favor, and recovery. Even when setbacks occur, they are temporary rather than defining. This consistency trains the spirit to remain hopeful and steadfast regardless of external fluctuations. Ultimately, declaring victory before the day unfolds is an act of faith and responsibility. It is choosing to lead the day rather than be led by it. The believer acknowledges that while they cannot control every event, they can control their response and expectation. By starting the day with declarations of victory, they align themselves with divine strength, wisdom, and peace. As the day progresses, challenges may arise, but victory has already been declared. This declaration becomes a reference point, reminding the believer that they are not fighting for victory. They are standing from a position of victory. The day may test faith, but it will also reveal the power of words spoken in belief and alignment with God. Establishing spiritual authority through spoken words is rooted in the understanding that words are not passive expressions, but active instruments that shape realities. From the beginning of creation, spoken words have carried creative power, and this principle continues to govern spiritual interactions today. When a believer speaks intentionally and in alignment with divine truth, those words become a channel through which authority is exercised. Silence does not neutralize spiritual activity. It often leaves space for other voices to dominate. Speaking, therefore, is not optional, it is essential. Spiritual authority is not derived from volume or emotion, but from alignment. Words spoken in agreement with God's will carry weight because they represent His authority, not human opinion. When a believer understands this, their speech becomes deliberate and disciplined. They do not speak carelessly or reactively because they recognize that every word released has the potential to influence outcomes. This awareness transforms speech from habit into stewardship. The act of speaking establishes boundaries. When words are spoken with faith and clarity, they define what is permitted and what is resisted. Declaring peace resists chaos. Declaring truth resists deception. Declaring strength resists fear. These declarations are not wishful thinking, they are acts of spiritual governance. By speaking, the believer asserts their role as a participant in shaping their environment rather than a passive observer. Spoken words also align the inner man. The heart often follows the mouth. When faith-filled words are spoken, they reinforce belief and weaken doubt. This internal alignment is critical because authority exercised outwardly must first be established inwardly. A believer who consistently speaks victory, clarity, and purpose trains their mind to agree with these truths, even when circumstances suggest otherwise. Over time, this practice builds confidence and stability. Establishing authority through words also affects consistency. Many people know what they believe, but inconsistency in speech undermines their authority. Words spoken in frustration, fear, or unbelief can contradict earlier declarations. Learning to govern speech requires discipline and awareness. It does not mean ignoring reality. It means choosing which reality has the final word. This discipline strengthens spiritual maturity and credibility. Another dimension of spoken authority is timing. Speaking early establishes precedence. When a believer speaks before situations escalate, they set the tone rather than reacting to pressure. This proactive approach reduces panic and increases clarity. Early declarations act as anchors, providing stability when the day becomes unpredictable. This is why morning declarations are especially powerful. They frame the day before other influences compete for dominance. Spoken words also create accountability. When a believer declares intentions aligned with God's purpose, they are more likely to act accordingly. Speech becomes a commitment that guides behavior. Declaring discipline encourages disciplined actions. Declaring peace encourages calm responses. In this way, words do not only influence external circumstances, they also shape personal conduct and character. Over time, establishing spiritual authority through spoken words produces measurable fruit. Confidence increases, fear diminishes, and decision-making improves. The believer becomes more aware of the impact of their speech and more intentional in its use. Relationships benefit as communication becomes clearer and more constructive. Challenges are approached with assurance rather than hesitation. Ultimately, spoken words are a bridge between the spiritual and the physical. They translate belief into action and faith into influence. By consistently speaking in alignment with divine truth, the believer exercises authority that shapes their life and environment. The day may present obstacles, but words spoken with faith become tools of navigation and victory. As this practice becomes a lifestyle, the believer realizes that authority is not about control, but about responsibility. Speaking with intention is an act of leadership over one's life. Through disciplined and faith-filled speech, spiritual authority is established, maintained, and expressed, allowing the believer to walk through each day with confidence, clarity, and purpose.